All right. Thank you all for joining us today for today's seminar in the weekly seminar series hosted by the Living Earth Collaborative and Washington University's Ecology, Evolution, and Population Biology group. Before we get going, I just want to remind you all that tomorrow, Friday, April 15th, from 2 to 3 p.m., the Living Earth Collaborative and WashU's Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Equity will be hosting a panel discussion entitled From Cahokia to Pruitt-Igoe, The History of Development, Environmental Justice, and Biodiversity in the St. Louis region. We have an absolutely amazing group of historians, architects, writers, environmental chemists, and biologists who will be talking about patterns of development, land use, and environmental justice in St. Louis. And you'll be able to find the link to the live stream in the chat section, as well as some more information about the discussion. And I hope that you all will join us for what promises to be a fascinating and important talk. However, today I have the distinct pleasure of getting to introduce our speaker, Derek Hoeferlin. Derek is an award-winning architect whose work focuses on water-based design strategies across various watersheds, including the Mississippi, Mekong, and Rhine. Derek has an impressive academic pedigree, earning his bachelor's and master's of architecture from Tulane University before moving on to earn a post-professional master's of architecture from Yale University. Currently, he's an associate professor at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts here at Washington University in St. Louis. Derek's work has been published in many well-read outlets, including Landscape Architecture Magazine, Metropolis, and the Anthropocene Review. His projects have also won numerous awards, including at the Design Resilience International Open Competition and the Rising Tides Competition. Along with Yvonne Jimenez, Derek has also recently received a seed grant from the Living Earth Collaborative to study the sustainable economic, architectural, and landscape design activities of the Paramo of Colombia. And finally, I should mention that I believe that Derek has a book coming out soon entitled Way Beyond Bigness, The Need for Watershed Architecture, and I hope that you'll all be on the lookout for that. So lastly, before I turn the mic over to Derek, I'm going to remind you all in the audience to leave any questions or comments that you have in the chat section next to your video screen, and William and I will be sure to relay them at the end of the presentation. And so with that, I want to thank you all again for attending, and I want to thank Derek for agreeing to present today, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you now, Derek.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm assuming that's a go. I'm assuming everyone can see that. So I'm honored to be here today, presenting as part of the Living Earth Collaborative speaker series. And I want to especially thank, of course, the Living Earth Collaborative, and more specifically, Jonathan Lassos, who reached out to me a couple of years ago, and we started up a great conversation about collaborative research across WashU, and of course, connecting to places like the Missouri Botanical Garden and the zoo. As Michael said, I'm a practicing architect, but my research has steered much more in the direction of larger challenges that relate to architecture, especially at multiple scales, that are really about kind of infrastructural transformation across entire river basins, and in the face of things like climate change and other challenges. So as he said, I've been working on a book now for over a decade. It will be out later this summer, which I'm very excited about, called Way Beyond Bigness, The Need for a Watershed Architecture. The first slide, this first image you see, so you're going to see mostly photographs that I've taken, field documentation across these three river basins for the last number of years, but this is far upriver on the Missouri River, not the Mississippi River. And this is Fort Peck Dam. Some of you may have been here or may be familiar, but this is kind of the first of what's called the Big Six dams, which are large dams that were constructed back in the middle of the 20th century, originally for flood control, but then quickly for other uses such as irrigation, supply, and hydropower. But Fort Peck Dam, this quote, still at the time, at present, is the largest hydraulically filled earthen dam in the world, which is quite impressive when you think about the scale of things that have happened since the construction of this dam many, many decades ago. The first question I want to ask is, in terms of this pursuit that I think most of us have about trying to figure out collaborative, truly multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research. This quote by Augusta Golden from a book about 40 years ago, says we need many important people at the table, but in this quote, It doesn't mention, and it's not kind of saying that this is ill intent, of course, but the word designers or architects or even artists are not part of this quote. And I would make the argument that designers hopefully can and should be. So some definitions, just backing up real quick. As we all know, the traditional known definition of a watershed, of course, is an area of ridge of land that separates waters flowing to different rivers, basins, or seas. But there's also the double meaning of the word watershed, which is something that I consider equally as important, an event or period marking a turning point in the course of action or state of affairs. This is a photograph I took a few months after Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. So, we seem like we're rapid fire getting hit with these tipping point watershed moments every day. Architecture itself, what I'm trained to practice legally to do, the art or practice of designing and constructing buildings, which first and foremost is important for architecture, but the double meaning of architecture, strangely and kind of insanely vague, is the complex or carefully designed structure of something. This quote can kind of as a threat to the discipline of architecture, but it really casts the net in a much broader way of what do we think the term architecture means. So Way Beyond Bigness prioritizes, like I said, the understanding of larger scale effects of watersheds for design decisions. Specifically, how can water integrate better with the built environment? And then secondly, this inevitable yet resilient need to adapt to contemporary watershed events in time. Way Beyond Bigness realigns both watersheds and architecture across multiple scales, from the site to the river basin, disciplines from ecologists to economists, narratives from the hyperbolic to the realistic, and venues from the academic to the professional. So given our contemporary kind of complex challenges, especially in relation to water, this cannot be done by one author or one architect. We need collaborations. I'm probably preaching to the choir, but these collaborations need to be different. They need to break down, our typical professional and academic dichotomies, for instance. But saying all this, a lot of the stuff I'll show today may come off as dire or pessimistic, kind of the world we live in right now, but it's really about opportunities and not crises. We need to be much more proactive and not reactive. We need to think not just what happens downstream, but where it comes from far upstream. And of course, still have to be pragmatic and hopefully optimistic. So what I've developed in this book and in my research is a simple, it's nothing unique, kind of methodology that's structured in 3 parts, about analysis, but it's not just analysis, it's about appreciation. What does it mean to truly appreciate contexts and sites in different ways? It's about synthesizing, but with synthesis comes the notion of speculation. That's where architects and landscape architects and designers kind of can cast a different way of thinking about things. And when we collaborate, it's just not for the pursuit of collaboration or getting more grants. It's about catalyzing. How do we actually enact, hopefully change, but maybe in different ways? So the first part I'm going to talk about, which will be the majority of the work that I'll show you today, is this need for transboundary understandings, appreciating and analyzing. This is a photograph, by the way, of the riverfront here at St. Louis and Choteau's Landing and low water level, just south of the Arch. So I've developed with research assistants and students here at WashU and the Sandfox School over a number of years, then a series of atlases that compare 3 different river basins. As Michael mentioned, the Mekong, the Mississippi, and the Rhine river basin. And then they're done at multiple scales, from the biggest, starting with the world, to the continental scale, and then down into the territorial scale, which starts to break up the watersheds into their smaller watersheds, or more technically subbasins, to the regional scale, and ultimately a site scale, but more of a zone, because these infrastructural acts are gigantic in and of themselves. So as you can see on the right, this is kind of how I've drawn them with research assistants. Very simple black and white drawings with red, and red indicates power in all these drawings, different forms of power. So the first question is why? Why these three river basins? I'm sure several of you have done work, deeper work than I have in these three river basins. But why the Mississippi, Mekong, and Rhine, other than personal reasons? The personal reasons, I live in the Mississippi. I grew up here in St. Louis. I lived in New Orleans for a number of years. The Mekong, I love Southeast Asia. I love visiting there. I've been very fortunate to do so several times. And the Rhine, professionally, with my work in New Orleans, I worked with a lot of Dutch down there on water issues, so I have a lot of Dutch friends. So those are the personal reasons, but the more kind of questioning reasons or the research ones, and these are overly simplistic questions, maybe provocative, but you can make the argument in the Mississippi, because it's a 20th century engineered system, might be stagnating, both physically, possibly in other ways, socially and politically, if we go down that rabbit hole. Accelerating. The Mekong is rapidly being developed, massive infrastructural projects, of course, a huge amount of investment from countries upriver in the basin like China. And then the Rhine, you could say, is adapting or has been adapting in terms of climate change policy, things happening especially in the Netherlands, but also upriver in Germany and France and Switzerland. But those are maybe a little too simplistic. The first thing that I would say you need to do when you look at this work, and what I've been doing, is understanding the management structures of each one of these. Obviously, all three have very different political structures, and they're managed differently. So these are, again, showing the scale drawings of the three, the countries that, for instance, happen within, and what are their management structures in terms of river engineering and other types of watershed planning. These drawings are going to be pretty indecipherable on your screen. It's a lot of information, but I've been constructing a series of flow charts. On the left shows how the Mississippi River Basin, through the Mississippi River Commission, of course, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, is organized, but then how it feeds all the way back up, of course, to acts of Congress. Our elected officials are the ones who mandate what the Corps of Engineers goes out and does and how the money is spent. But then from the bottom up, of course, a lot of nonprofits and NGOs that both lobby, but also study and do very important research. And on the right is a drawing of the different districts of the Corps of Engineers. Just quickly, and then on the left is the Mekong, and then on the right is the Rhine. The Mekong kind of de facto is organized and coordinated through the Mekong River Commission for Sustainable Development, which has become much more robust just in recent years. China and Myanmar, for instance, are dialogue partners, so they're not technically officially part of the Mekong River Commission, which of course complicates things. Then on the right is the Rhine, which is a much longer, of course, established European context for management, but theirs really is pretty clearly split between the Central Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine, because the navigation and the economy in the central part of Europe is so instrumental, but then the very important International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine, which is the environmental leg and watchdog for efforts and pollution and things like that happen in the Rhine. But of course, both funded very differently. And then I go into a series of comparative metrics that show simply, and again, scaled, so you can see the difference, the territories of the three basins, the tributaries of the three basins, water volume, topographies. As you can see, the Mississippi, especially the main stem, is far less than the Rhine but even more so the Mekong, which goes up into the foothills and the Himalayas and up into Tibet. So what I'm going to go deeper into today is one of the three. I typically talk about the Mississippi River Basin a lot. I don't want to say I getting tired of it, but I usually the context of my talks are in the context of St. Louis or New Orleans or other parts of the watershed. But the Mekong is quite fascinating. These are photographs, and it just shows just kind of more from a even spatial poetic sense, the difference of the water across the river. When we think of rivers, we think of a certain color or a certain of turbidity or turbulence, what have you. And just even within the Mekong, it changes radically. So this is the first one that shows the first scale, the world. This is just a simple kind of drawing of the Mekong within the context, of course, of Asia and the Pacific. But the quote on the right, if you can see it, it might be covered up a little. it talks first about the Amazon River, and this is a quote from the Mekong River Commission, being the wealthiest, and I say wealthiest carefully in terms of fish, but the Mekong has an astounding amount of both fish volume and water volume, and then how important it is for so many people that live in countries, especially places like Vietnam, Cambodia, and parts of Thailand and Laos. And then the next scale in is the territory. This is a photograph of one of the canals done in the Mekong Delta from a little over a decade ago. And then the icon in the upper left with these red boxes shows the different scales zooming down from the territory ultimately to the zone scale. So this is the first one at the continent. Two parts to the basin, the upper Mekong Basin, and the lower Mekong Basin. And you can see this kind of how thin the beginning of the Mekong is, and that's because it's where all these these amazing rivers that originate up in Qinghai and Tibet, and then snake through kind of the foothills of the Himalayas, and then down, and then eventually, once it meets to the lower basin, spreads out into kind of the Mekong that most of us think about. So with those planned drawings, we've been constructing a series of correlating sections, and these are all orthographic drawings, which is a typical tool of not just architects of how we draw plans and sections of buildings, but also engineers. So this is kind of maybe in a critical way looking at how we tend to draw these things. So the point is that these rivers maybe aren't as river-like as we think they are, especially when drawn through an infrastructural lens. And then more specifically, these red cascading things you see are the dams that have been constructed, especially in China and the Yunnan province. And then the ones that are dashed are the planned ones. So this is a big deal that's happening in the Mekong right now. Serious ambitions for predominantly hydropower, but also water control. And then as you make your way down through Laos, and then the flatter portion of the Mekong, eventually in the bottom right, you're down into the Delta. So anyway, the sections are vertically exaggerated, like you have to when you draw anything at such large scales. And then the next scale in is the territory. So this is the upper Mekong River Basin. This photograph is at the Golden Triangle in where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand come together. And then here you can start to see scaling in the more where all the dams are located, the thinness of it, and kind of just this funneling of vast amount of water and how much of a power that can become for urbanized areas around it, which you might not be able to see. There's a lot of really light red, delicate lines that are across this map. Those are transmission lines, and it shows the beginning understanding of these dams that are being constructed are designed to export power thousands of miles away to places like Guangdong province in China. And then the next section through that, and then as you start to go in, you can see these red lines that are coming out of those dams that are showing how much, what the names of the dams are, but the power and where they're going to, which, for instance, the West East Electricity Transfer Project, to be able to get this energy to large urbanized areas in China. Moving into the next scale is of the first territory is the region. So this is where this region specifically is where the Mekong and the Yangtze rivers come together towards another dam. This photograph is of Dali up in Yunnan province, which technically is not in the Mekong River Basin, but there's a lake in the background of this photo, Erhai Lake, which is quite important because when you look at this plan here you can see these two rivers coming together down to the Jaibury Dam. As a result of these dams, as you all know, these giant reservoirs are created behind them, which all do all sorts of things environmentally, ecologically, et cetera. But when the volume of water becomes so intense, that reservoir in the Yangtze River is actually backing all the way back up even to Erhai Lake and Dali potentially. So this just kind of the backwater effect that's happening to very historic places like Dali, for instance, could be transformative. And then as these sections get dialed in even more, again, the vertical exaggeration kind of makes them look a bit wonky, but shows again the kind of the constructed condition. And then you can see how large these dams are, like the Jaiwan, and then again, where it's going out to, and specifically which provinces it's heading out to. This is all, what's amazing is all this information is publicly available, which at first you think might not be, but this is all done from, serious mining by my research assistants of GIS data sets, and, cross-referencing it. So it's all there. This is the one photograph I did not get to take. So this is from international rivers, actually. I have not been able to make it up this far into China. It's quite intense to get to these parts. So this is kind of what the scale of these dams are. And then here's the plan of it. And when you get to zoom in more, you can see this, if you can, there's a white dashed doubled line. That's the former path of the Mekong. And then the black with the bathymetry underneath it shows the reservoir that's being created. The red curved is the double arched curved construction of the dam, and then other things such as the switching stations and things like that that are part of the power generation too. And these are two sections. One's cut looking back towards the dam of that photograph that you just saw, and then even the transmission lines showing that how that becomes a real new form of the built environment, just something that we take for granted, power lines and transmission lines, but the feet to do those and how those alter the landscape, and then a cross section showing the reservoir. And then so just that giant step, maybe just in the simplest terms, like the Mekong has completely changed for the foreseeable future. So that's the first territory. The second one is moving into the lower Mekong Basin, where things radically change geographically, geomorphology, climatically, et cetera. Then you can see in the icon the two smaller zones that we've been looking at. Again, the very different context down in the bottom part, for some those that are familiar, is the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the part in Cambodia when during seasonal dry, wet conditions during the wetter times, Mekong actually reverses its flow naturally and backs up and fills up this giant bladder and becomes one of the most important fisheries in the world. The jury's still out, but conventional wisdom is these large dams far upriver are completely altering that pulsing of water, threatening the future viability of the entire, not just the entire Mekong Delta, but the Tonle Sap region as well. Which is what this drawing shows here. At the bottom, you see the section through that all the way through, but above it, then we split out the Tonle Sap Lake. That shows during the dry season, the flow is going still downriver, whereas in the wet, it's backing up, and you can see the pulsing of it. The images in the upper left are me going down the river on a number of trips, and so show things like further up part in the higher part of this lower basin, palm oil farming, which is hugely, challenging to the environment. But then places like rice farming further down that are at threat, coastal armoring of concrete flood protection in the Delta, and then future dam sites. The one on the left is where the Sambor Dam, the proposed dam, is going to go, which would alter this whole area. This is moving into the region towards Luang Prabang. This is coming down river on a boat that I was on for a number of days. And then these towers that you see constructing are the new high-speed train that's going to connect Yunnan province ultimately to the idea is to Kuala Lumpur through Laos. And so you go by these things, and the construction signs are all written in Mandarin, and you can really quickly see kind of the large presence of China in a place like Laos. And that's the plan of this, which can kind of decipher in the bottom right is Jaibury Dam, which so the dam construction becomes different down here. And then the photographs in the upper ribbon, again, showing like where the proposed, this is what the geography looks like at the proposed Pak Ben Dam site. The reservoir created by the already constructed Jaibury Dam, the new roads, and then in the upper right is one of the relocated communities. So where the dam was, where the reservoir filled it up, there's been a state-funded program to relocate people. What kind of social services and all that are part of it is a question. And then the section through those parts. And then this is the dam. I was fortunate 2 years ago on one of my trips to be escorted by the Mekong River Commission and the Minister of Mines and Infrastructure from Laos to go to Jaibury Dam. This is technically the only place you're allowed to take a photograph of it. This was before it became fully operational in 2019. So it's a run of the river dam. It's not nearly as big, of course, as the Cascade Dam, Jaiwan, but it's still drastic. It's this is the first main stem dam on the Mekong in Laos, or at this lowest portion. So it was quite fascinating to be there while it was still under construction. And these are our drawings of it. Again, we've been mining publicly available information. We believe that this work should be legibly publicly available. So this is still showing it kind of under construction. And then some of my other photographs on the left, through the different critical construction, they're installing. The Mekong River Commission made the Thai energy company that is constructing this. So to be clear, this dam is being funded by a Thai electrical company, and the majority, if not all, of that power is being exported to places such as Chiang Mai and Bangkok. So the Laos is actually selling off this energy to wealthier neighboring states. And then but the Mekong River Commission went back and reviewed it, and they had to put a fish ladder and a sediment sluice back into the design and construction of these. The question is, there's never been a fish ladder or a sediment sluice that's been tested at the scale of what's going through the Mekong River, the amount of fish that are going through. This is not your salmon ladder up in the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest. This is a gazillion amount of fish that are going up and down river. So the jury's out on whether these will even work. And then moving down finally to the border of Laos and Cambodia. If anyone's been there, it's quite spectacular. I highly recommend anyone to go there. This is the view from the small village right there, which is just at the border. But what's really special about this part of the Mekong River is this is where the remaining, few dozen of the Irrawaddy dolphins are. If any of you know about the Irrawaddy dolphins, they're a dolphin that can live both in salt and fresh water. So this is thousands of miles upstream. There are these amazing dolphins. There used to be many, many thousands of them, but they were eradicated by people like the Khmer Rouge. But so anyway, this is a very ecologically sensitive part of the river. And there's a dam that's finishing construction, the Don Sahong Dam, which is a kind of a diversion dam. So luckily they didn't kind of decapitate the whole part of the river right here. But this is where all the higher part of the river comes through these series of cascading waterfalls. It's called the 4,000 Islands region, and then drops down. In the upper right, you can see what it's like in the dry season and in the wet season. So a radical pulsation of water comes through here. Here you can see the photographs in the upper left. The middle photograph shows a tree. So this is when I was there during dry season. And you can see the roots that are just kind of pushed over, many, many years by the force of the river. The one on the left is a former river level gauge built out of stone in Cambodia that would have been built probably by the French. And then the explanation of where that power is going, for instance, in Thailand. And this is a picture of that region and the low water level. So in the wet season, this right here, you'd be underwater. That's how much volume is ripping through this portion of the river. And I really like this drawing because it just gives this kind of amazing kind of braided view of this region. So the Mekong at this point is not just a river as we typically know it, but it just spreads out in so many directions. And the bottom part of the image is where it then spreads out and becomes the really big Mekong that we know. But on the right is where you can see the dam construction. So they've diverted it, and it's meant to take all this power. Since I've been there, I haven't been there in over a decade, a lot of development has happened here. It's a bigger tourist destination, a lot of development pressure. So the Mekong kind of just, these are some themes that I've come to terms with. It's a place about fluctuating levels. This is a village where they're able to actually move their house up and down. The architecture is truly adaptable based on flooding. It's a place, of course, of harvesting fish, these amazing fish nets that this one, you drop it down into the water, you wait, 20 minutes, pull it up, and you've got, hundreds of fish right there. It's also a place that's struggling with fresh and salt balance. What does it mean to farm within that? So the upper right image, if you can see it, are fish drying on the, or rice, I'm sorry, drying on the side of the road. So that's fresh. And then on the bottom is salt. So there's all these salt flats. So you have this kind of natural condition of the brackish, but also much more saline is intruding due to sea level rise and climate change. And then other things which are devastating. It's a huge campaign of mining sand, the sand economy. So the upper right is one of those sand mines. And then on the photograph in the bottom is just south of Phnom Penh, where they're dealing with catastrophic erosion issues along the river. So within this part of the book, and I then have guest contributions. So this one is about the development of the Mekong, that really goes through like how the Mekong has been developed since the Vietnam War, especially with Chinese and Japanese funding by Dorothy Tang. This, again, the photographs that I took of the infrastructure that's being built. This is a place called Las Vegas, which is a huge casino, special economic zone at the Golden Triangle in Laos on an island that's run by a Chinese company. There's an essay that the members of the Mekong River Commission agreed to write about explaining the economic and environmental balancing act that they have to do with the development of the Mekong. And then one about adaptation by Shelby Doyle, who teaches at Iowa State, an architect, where she did a Fulbright that studied things like the photograph I showed, how the vernacular architecture actually is doing a lot of these things, but they're at threat based on increased changes. I was the person that helped me get through these trips, and I've met before, Dr. Duong Van Nie is an agricultural scientist at Can Tho University. So he wrote an essay about his monitoring kits that he works with local farmers to go out with low-tech instruments and test out the saline levels. These are drawings that we did of his work. So my research assistants redrew the stuff that he's did, so tying in together his important work with our work. And then real quickly, I'm just going to show a couple images of similarly of the Mississippi in the world. This is, for instance, the Missouri River Basin, which has, like I said, those big dams, the Fort Peck Dam, and the kind of massive hydropower project that was done last century with the Pick-Sloan plan. And then the reservoirs that were created because of those. So of course, you could say the Mekong is kind of following in the footsteps of the Missouri and the Mississippi management. But here, the inundation of lands were much more catastrophic for places like tribal reservations, for instance. The Rhine River Basin, very different water context, and much more dense, of course, in the European context. But this is a plan drawing of one of the Dutch government's Room for the River program that they've been implementing over the last couple decades in response to increased surges. And this is the town of Nijmegen at the German border, where they're doing these pretty incredible projects where they're making bypass channels to allow floodwaters, but also to think about drought conditions too, and make these much more publicly amenable spaces. So I'm going to wrap up with this portion of the talk, and then I'm going to move into the current work with in Colombia with the grant. So we got another 10 or 15 minutes, hopefully, for me to talk. But there are clues with all this, and there are possibilities. This is me taking my students out several years ago in the backwaters of the Mississippi with my friend Chuck Tiling, who works for the Corps of Engineers. There are clues to replenish, to redistribute, to reboot. So that gets into the speculation section, the need for transboundary watershed architecture. So back to the Mekong, this was, Michael mentioned a design competition I did a few years ago with Jess Vanacek and others. This was for asking about speculative ideas about dealing with water scarcity of all things. And it was a resiliency competition. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to do a speculation on what would it mean to think about a transboundary relationship of the Mekong in relation to power and water scarcity. And so we did this really dynamic map that mapped out all the existing power generation and how it's being exported out primarily to China, but also showing the consequences of blocked fish migrations, disrupted flood cycles and drought cycles, suppressed sediments and nutrients. And this is at the upper basin. And then this shows the lower basin. We wrote a manifesto about transboundary resilience, but really it boiled down to like the threats of climate change, coupled with the issues of dam infrastructure, creating fresh water scarcities, which brings threats, but then we need adaptations to those threats. I won't go much into detail with that based on time, but it basically is like, how do you work with the water and live with the water as opposed to fight it and control it? Back in the Mississippi, a series of drawings I did with my colleague Ian Kane a number of years ago, where we were speculating on the future kind of migration patterns of the United States and North America, and specifically in relation to water. And this bottom map is us speculating on where the water will be, and rather be in the American Southwest. There's going to be a hell of a lot of it here in our region, in the Mississippi and Missouri. However, it might be very mismanaged right now. There will be a lot of it. There will also be droughts too, but thinking about where's the future place to be, probably where the water is. And then we proposed this, or I proposed this idea of an eco industry toolkit. There will be big industry in the future of the Mississippi. That's not going away anytime soon. Of course, we have big agriculture and big industry, but what does it mean to be much more sustainable? How do you think about wastes as resources? Instead of nutrient overloads being negative, how can they become sequestered and used for things like algae or wetland sinks? What does it mean to rethink the distribution of sediment and allow it to replenish wetlands or be brought back to the Delta of Louisiana? And my friend Chuck Tiling with the Corps, I mentioned he's doing these things on a much more local scale, working with local farmers to turn back tiled farmland into nutrient sinks and even use algae mats and other things like that. We've done a speculation for the Rhine that talks about kind of recentering the Rhine as like a circular economy in the future for Europe. What does it mean for the energy transition, climate adaptation? And of course, this is very complicated given the current geopolitical context that not just the Rhine, but all of Europe finds itself in right now in terms of energy. So finally, Collaborate and Catalyze. I'm going to flip through this project really quick because I want to get to the Columbia project, but I did a project with students a number of years ago, just a couple of years ago on a barge. We were able to get access to Continental Cement Company, which is on the North Riverfront here in St. Louis. And we put on a temporary installation where we thought about occupying places like barges. This is for cement transfer. We exhibited my drawings about barges on a barge. And then we held a quote unquote afternoon symposium, but instead of being in a conference room or Zoom room, we did it out on a barge, and we brought many different voices and many different opinions about the future sustainability of the Mississippi. So juxtaposing these two things, being on a barge and being on a canoe, you can do both on the Mississippi. This was a quick project, not a quick, but quickly I'll show you a project did in Columbus, Indiana last August, where it was the first time I was able to make a three-dimensional one-to-one human scale model of the drawings that I've showed you. This is of the Mississippi Basin split into different sub-basins. We held a public event, again, to talk about our relationship to these forms of power and what does it mean to live in this watershed. So finally, I'll spend the last 10 minutes kind of introducing this amazing project that is very much in process. And I'm very honored to have met Jonathan Lassos a couple of years ago, and he asked me to be a biodiversity fellow. And if I wasn't listed as that, I would have never gotten to know Yvonne Jimenez from the Missouri Botanical Garden, who reached out to me by finding my name on the Living Earth Collaborative website. So thank you for this. Yvonne and I successfully got a grant from the LEC last year. We were very ambitious at that time, thinking I would be traveling. Yvonne's been there a number of times, but I was not able to get there until just a couple of weeks ago. But it's also in collaboration with my students here at the Sam Fox School, both in landscape architecture and currently in architecture. This is a photo of Yvonne on the left and myself holding on to one of the plants that he and Erica on the right study, the Espeletia. I won't try to pronounce the other names of it, but spectacular plant that I never knew anything about. So I came to this project to learn a lot more about it. And they've been doing this amazing research on what's the future of this plant, which is completely endemic to the Paramo region in the Andes of Colombia. This is a photo I took there. This is in the Suma Pass, the national park that is spectacular. And you see these plants that are everywhere. You know, Ivan always says that they're everywhere, and they are. And they're different sizes and shapes, but also other clues by going there. There's also rock, you know, and other things, you know, that this landscape, it's a former glacial area, has other clues for how do you inhabit and how do you build in them. Super, super wet. This is a good photograph because it shows, this is up on the Paramos. This is probably up about 12,000 feet up or so. You can see cows in the distance. So the land use issues are real here. The kind of confrontation between ecology and the need for production, in this instance, cow pastures. So this was probably much more at one time full of Espeletias, but you can see these bogs. So when you're walking here, you're just like sinking in thick, wet soil. So my students last semester, the landscape architecture studio, part of the idea of the grant was to start to bring solutions to the actual specific site, the farm that Ivan and others are working on, but also we talked about needing to take a bigger picture view of this too, and situate the project, the very detail-oriented project within not just Colombia and South America, but the whole world. So this is one of my students that was studying the Magdalena River and the Paramo in relation to other river basins, the Irrawaddy and the Nile, through the intertropical convergence zone. So we were studying loosely, but getting these students really kind of learning about atmospheric rivers, and how at the bottom you can see a section that shows very simplistically the currents and the patterns of movement and how that affects the water distribution in a place like South America. This is just another student drawing that was really trying to understand the water trading or the future water trading across South America and the Amazon and the Andes. This drawing's probably kind of wild to look at, but looking at comparing the Amazon and the Mekong and the stresses in terms of things like deforestation, fires, and pollution. And then we built, do drawings and built models. This was fun. You know, this is kind of a classic example of the hybrid world we live in, at least last fall. So this is our students here in the Sandbox School presenting to Don Moises and Erica and Ivan in Colombia. So we were having a review of those previous drawings that you just saw. This is Ivan back in St. Louis, looking at the work that we were doing. In another part of the semester, we did something very different. So we did that analysis kind of at a larger analytical scale, but then I asked students to kind of humanize this. What does it mean to bring these challenges to the scale of the person, or more particular to the scale of the Espeletia? So they did a series of cartoons or graphic novels, making the plant the central character of them. But these are not just kind of loose drawings. I asked them to really, because these are landscape architecture students, to really study the plant themselves. So you start to hopefully see more scientific aspects put into this, but put into a story. What is the threat? What is the real kind of existential issue that this interesting plant is going through? And then Chen then took that, and I think this project was really interesting, very provocative and futuristic even, but he tapped into this relationship and this conflict between the cattle and the plant. And that's what this drawing shows, the current condition of the land uses. And then on the right, what would a future coexistence mean of cattle and Espeletia, but maybe something radical would have to happen, such as a new biogas generation landscape that could even be operated by artificial intelligence. And now I'm going probably totally sideways with this work, but I think we don't know what the future is in 2080. We don't know what it means for emissions control. We don't know who will be doing it. What will the labor be? Who are the people that will be there? And I think that's really starts to critically think about who are the communities Who are the partners? Who are the local farmers? Where will they be? And this is an aerial view of it. And when you look at this, you're like, oh, come on, this is crazy. And it is crazy. But then when we were down there, this is Erica when we're up in the Paramo, and this is far more, I don't want to say mundane, but what's happening here is in the background, you see the espeletias, but coexisting with that is cattle grazing. So they're already starting to test out this hybridization of uses, not canceling out the other. So I find it very curious when we look at Chen's project, maybe he's onto something, or maybe people are already onto something that we have to find different solutions. And it was really cool. Chen won an award by the American Society of Landscape Architects here, the St. Louis chapter. So it was recognized as being a very meritorious proposal. So that was really nice that the work from Columbia back home here in St. Louis has been recognized. So finally, I've got a couple minutes. I'm going to quickly show where we're at right now. This is the view on the El Carmen farm site where the biodiversity farm is happening. This is the sunset. It's beautiful. And this nursery, this Paramo nursery that Yvonne and Erica and others are working on, is for 4 things. It's for research, of course, for the conservation of biodiversity, education, bringing students here. This is meant to be a working research project, not a tourist destination, for ecological restoration. And then this interesting idea of a new version of ex situ conservation and what we're calling living collection nursery beyond walls, which is an interesting conceptual idea for an architect to think beyond walls of a building, but think about landscape. This is us arriving at the site. So it's these are Don Moises's existing house and farmhouse. They're dealing with serious water issues. So much of it's flying down into the site, sometimes flooding out their homes. But what's so amazing about the place is like 1 minute it could be like this. The next minute you're completely in a cloud. And then a few minutes later, it's sunny, right? So the change of environment throughout the day can be quite drastic. It could be very cold in the morning, and then it could be very warm in the afternoon. But throughout the year, it's relatively consistent. And of course, since you're near the equator, the sun isn't really moving much vertically. So that means a lot for architects and for how you design. And this is us showing some of the work down there, workshopping. My students made this really cool small 3D print of the site. And then we brought it and gave it as a gift to Don Moises. And then on the right is a drawing that I did of measuring all the existing structures there, and then talking about how we can start to either adapt these structures, build new structures for worker and researchers and students to come here. This is the mini site within the real site, kind of a meta moment. We're part of the grant would help fund us to get a drones. We've been doing aerial photography and drone documentation, but also we conducted a very in-depth LiDAR survey with the drone too. So we have an accurate survey of the contours. The drawings that I brought down, so we start to do field verifications and then get interrupted by the cows and the calves here. This is Don Moises on the left, and I believe his uncle who is walking by, but in the background, it's important. This is a horse trail that's right above his site, where all this water and heavy rains comes ripping down and goes right down into. So we've got to figure out ways of diverting that water, but not just getting rid of it, maybe harvesting it and using it for beneficial use on site. We're measuring the existing structures. This is the old barricade construction, which is earth and straw and animal manure and bamboo reinforcing. So there's thoughts, can we restore this? Can we preserve it and make it part of the new complex? Showing the kind of research that my students were doing in his house. So the wish list from Erica and the team is that it's got to be beautiful, not just practical, but it has to be useful and it has to optimize spaces. Erica already has built this amazing nursery. This is where they are putting their espeletias and that are growing them. So it's already happening on site. These are the different structures that need thinking about. So the ensemble, and I'm at 45 minutes here, I'm gonna wrap up, but there's 5 or 6 key things that we need to talk about and help design everything from structures to water management and pathways. The students have been looking at precedents around the world that can help inform us, think about ways of engaging the terrain in different ways. Different types of construction that are much more sustainable than using concrete, for instance, using the stone that's readily available, using timber, is readily available, but also new forms like rammed earth construction and not concrete. We've been testing out conceptual models with water, moving through the site, and what does it mean to put new structures. We work a lot in physical forms. These are conceptual models that start to talk about ways of habitating the slope. Models that take on ideas of studying rammed earth or the barricade construction. And then now we're getting into architectural proposals for new worker housing, new bedrooms, new research areas, and then reviewing the work. This is what we do in architecture school. This was just on Monday. We have a couple weeks left in the semester. We were very honored to have a world famous architect from Bangladesh, Marina Tasabam, join us on Monday, who does really compelling, beautiful vernacular based work in her country. Then I'll end with this. This is the team with Don Moises, Yvonne and Erica in the national park. And I want to thank not just the Living Earth Collaborative, but of course the Sandfox School here at WashU and the International Center for Environment, Energy and Sustainability, who has helped fund this work over a number of years. So with that, I guess I will stop share and I can take some Q&A.
Awesome. Well, that was so interesting, Derek. While we wait for some questions to come in on the chat section, I want to start off with one that your work made me sort of think about, which is in aquatic kind of ecology and freshwater sort of, when we approach like freshwater sort of conservation from an ecological perspective, we often ask this kind of rhetorical question, which is like, how wide is a river? And that's kind of a way of thinking about not only kind of the ecological interactions that are happening within the aquatic realm, but also trying to sort of broaden the scope to also consider the things that are happening in the surrounding riparian areas and even further out. And so I guess that, kind of is like a philosophical question. How do you approach that question of how wide is a river from your architectural perspective?
Well, that's a great question. And I won't try to pretend that I know the scientific answer to that. But one thing when I showed quickly that project I did in Columbus, Indiana with the Mississippi watershed, where we built that kind of crazy scaled model. And the question I asked then, is the watershed even a watershed anymore? I think that's the first question.
Sure, yeah.
So like some of the mappings, even though we're drawing the geographical boundary of the watershed, that ridge to ridge classic thing that we're taught hopefully in like first grade. But when you think of things like those power lines, those transmission lines that are going from, the Mekong, the geographical condition and resource of it to power Hong Kong, right? Or to power Bangkok. And so I chair not just the landscape architecture program, but the urban design program. And like we talk about sustainable cities and sustainable development and densifying cities, but you kind of have to ask the question of, well, where's that power coming from? Sure. It's coming from some other watershed that no longer is defined by its boundary anymore, because it becomes a political boundary. It becomes a power brokered boundary. It's a public-private boundary. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think some instances, yes, you have to be very specific about the reality of the geography and the landscape, but at other times you have to scale it out.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yes, while we're still waiting for the questions, a really, really fascinating seminar, Derek. I was really enjoying all these pictures, especially from Colombia, from the Andes, because it reminds me my home country, Peru. I was really excited watching this. It's like, oh, that's so cool. So I have a curiosity. Sometimes the locals can be really not open to the people. So I was wondering how, you work with Senor Moises, which seems like really open to you, but I don't know if you have interactions with more locals in the Andes and how they were like getting these ideas of the landscape architecture and how they can apply them.
No, that's a great question. And, Yvonne Jimenez, we talked about it as well. What's I think pretty cool about the team, I'll start with just the smallest scale of it. What Yvonne and others have put together, I don't think we all necessarily agree on what should happen. And so there's internal, conversations and conflicts between like what does Don Moises think is appropriate for his rightfully so, his farm. Erica, what her thoughts are and what does it mean to be bringing these plants to a farm that's meant for cattle primarily for generation. Ivan, and I don't want to speak on behalf of Ivan, but he's from Colombia, but working for the Missouri Botanical Garden. So there's a complication there, that hence the kind of critique we're having about where should these activities actually be happening. But the general sense I get, first of all, is that Don Moises and some other people there are very open to thinking differently about how things would happen, but being very respectful of the existing context. But there is questions about, like, wait a minute, will this bring tourism here? Why are we doing this? We have to be very careful about what the programming is of this. And that's why we're saying this is a working project. This is a working farm. This is for researchers. This is for students. We're already being very careful not to, because there isn't much money to pull this project off, but we don't want to design something that's like, we're different all of a sudden, right? But I haven't gotten that deep into it. I defer more to Ivan and others, but there are complicated questions from the neighboring communities about what's happening here. But I don't mean that in a negative way. I think it's a really important debate to have. I don't know what you think, William. I mean, because this is more, you know much more about it than I would.
Well, I don't know about Colombia, but I can tell you about the Andes of Peru. And so first, like, they have like this communal meetings. So, yeah. And sometimes they're really open to like the outside innovations. And what you're doing with this greenhouse, I'm pretty sure that the people in Peru and the Andes will welcome that, because it will maximize different ways, again, produce things in a greenhouse. So it uses those greenhouses for seedlings or saplings. And I think they will be really open. And I was also wondering if you're doing this as a case study, maybe you can just expand to more like sites in the Andes.
That's the idea. That's the hope. I mean, that's why that's what's really cool about this being a seed funded project, that we can scale this up and have other partners. That's music to our ears, because I think that's the danger is always creating the one-off, right? Because then you got all your eggs in one basket at that point.
When you approach looking at these different like major river basins, like one thing that obviously sticks out and that you mentioned a little bit is that the Mississippi is all in the United States, but like the Mekong is across a whole bunch of different countries, as is the Rhine. And so like what kind of challenges does that present to you as someone who's trying to understand kind of the architecture? Like, are there major differences, or is it pretty like, are these kind of watershed sort of conservation units, do they make it sort of more or less the same from a practical standpoint of you trying to kind of like get access to the information and try to analyze the things? Or I guess I'm curious about kind of like the differences in analyzing these different watersheds that you're working on, just as a function of the Mississippi being all in the United States, whereas these other basins are in different, or across a whole bunch of different countries.
Well, I mean, the first thing is like when since the Mississippi, except for like a small sliver up in Alberta and Saskatchewan provinces, are in one country, and we're like, I think things should work pretty smoothly, right? Yeah, kind of. But, I mean, we are a bunch of states to begin with, and then the Corps of Engineers is I don't want to sound negative, but it's completely balkanized as well. I mean, it's all these different districts. So St. Louis finds itself by nature of being at the confluence of multiple rivers. St. Louis is actually split between two districts. They're the upper Mississippi, or the St. Louis district, but then the Missouri district as well. So the Missouri River comes in, and so you've got a river that's coming in, and the decisions by the Corps in that jurisdiction are being made about water, retaining water up behind those big dams in South and North Dakota and Montana. And then, but downriver, you're like, wait a minute, we've got a drought down here. We need that water. So even though we're in one country, the conflicts, and again, straight up conflicts between the districts of the Corps of Engineers already reinforce something similar that may happen between Germany and the Netherlands, right? What happens? Like there was a very, I think, real political reason why the Netherlands decided to make their first and most ambitious Room for the River program right at the border of Germany and the Netherlands. They're like, we're gonna, right when that water crosses the border, we're gonna manage it right there and do this amazing project that's about public space and all this. And it wasn't, I don't think it was just for granted that they did it at that spot between the two different countries, right? Not that they don't get along, but
Sure.
right, they're trying to say like, you know, this is where you have to make this. And then the Mekong, I mean, you know, the majority of the countries are, you know, totalitarian regimes or communist governments. And then you've got someone like Thailand that's a very different economy that's coming in with this massive amount of investment from one side of it to get power. And then you've got China from the other end with this amount of power and money from the other end. And then you got a place like Laos that's landlocked in the middle, right? And be like, yeah, let's sell it. You know, we need to make some money on this thing. So it's a similar trading that's happening. So some similarities and some totally different. But I wouldn't say just because that's what's dangerous about looking at the Mississippi and the US and be like, oh, it's one country. But oh man, talk about because the scale of it's so huge too.
Yeah.
Right? It's so big land-wise.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I want to take you again to the Andes. So I know that you show more about the rivers and the watershed and all that. So one thing that I was wondering, because you've been there in the Andes and you actually saw all these mountains and beautiful mountains, is about the power lines. So in my research site, for example, we have these beautiful mountains and then, you know, the power lines were on and it just kind of ruined the landscape view. And I was wondering what would be your thoughts or your viewpoint of as a landscape architecture, if you can speculate how we can make those power lines less ugly.
The easy answer would be to bury them, right? You know, but that's but hiding things is not necessarily the right idea either, you know. I don't know. I think, you know, I don't know. I think most people don't even recognize them. You know, there's this book that was written a number of years ago by Bruce Miles, a graphic designer, called Massive Change, which was like, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. But one of the first images is this giant image of like a transmission line that's been completely collapsed by an ice storm. And then the quote says, "Design is invisible until it fails." Right? We don't see, most people, you see them because you're aware or hyper aware of the Andes, right? That's your thing. And you're like, oh, those power lines, right? But most people don't even know they're there, right? We take for granted infrastructure. We want to look at beautiful things. We want to look at, our eyes are drawn to mountains, or our eyes are drawn to rivers. They're drawn to beautiful cities or architecture, but we don't want to look at the roads. We don't want to look at the infrastructure, right? And there's a real fallacy in that, I think, you know. I don't know what to do with them. The only thing I know is that when we went up with Yvonne, when we crossed over 3,000 meters, it's a part in the Andes where there's this giant transmission line, and that's the gap, right? And it's this like vortex of air, and that's where the power lines are. And it's like this exquisite moment in the geography, and you're like, giant power lines, right? So anyhow.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Derek. This was a really fascinating talk. We're really glad that we were able to get you in for a seminar.
Cool.
And so with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up, and hopefully we'll see many of our viewers tomorrow for our second annual discussion about environmental justice. And if not, we'll see everybody next week. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.